Don't leave me to freeze. I'll give you a warm bed every night," begged the desperate Apache woman. Violated word. Aviad. Any violated content, the winter came earlier than anyone expected. It did not arrive gently or with warning. It came like a hard door slammed shut on the land. The sky stayed gray for days, heavy and low, as if it were pressing down on the earth. Snow fell without rest, covering the hills, the trees, and the narrow paths that once guided travelers through the region. The cold was sharp and cruel, the kind that bit through clothing and settled deep into the bones. The Apache woman had learned long ago how to read the land. She knew the signs of bad weather, the way animals moved, the smell of snow before it came. But this storm was different. It was stronger than anything she remembered. Even the elders, those who had lived through many winters, had not spoken of cold like this. Her people had already been struggling before the snow began. They had been pushed from their familiar lands, forced to move again and again, never staying long enough to feel safe. Hunting had become harder. Food was scarce. Children cried at night from hunger, and the old grew quiet, saving their strength. Fires were smaller now, wood carefully counted. Every decision was about survival. The woman had once had a family of her own, a husband who laughed easily, children who ran beside her and held her hands when they crossed streams. That life felt distant now, like a story told by someone else. Illness had taken her children one by one during a harsh summer. Her husband had died the following winter while searching for food. Since then, she had learned to live with a constant ache inside her chest, a quiet pain that never fully went away. When the snowstorm began, the small group she traveled with knew they could not stay where they were. The wind cut through their shelter, and the animals they relied on had moved away. The leaders decided to head south, hoping to find lower ground and better chances of survival. It was a dangerous journey, but staying was worse. The woman tried to keep up as they moved, but her body was weak from hunger and long grief. Each step through the deep snow took more strength than she had. Her feet felt numb, her legs shook. By the second day, her breathing became shallow and her vision blurred. They stopped only briefly, long enough to drink melted snow and share what little food remained. She saw the looks on their faces, not cruel, but afraid. Afraid of the storm, afraid of losing more people, afraid of slowing down. Survival made people hard in ways they never expected. When she stumbled and fell for the third time, she knew the truth before anyone spoke it. If she continued with them, she would slow them down. If they stayed with her, they might all die. No one said it out loud at first. The wind howled around them, filling the silence. Finally, an older woman stepped forward and knelt beside her. She placed a hand on her shoulder, her eyes full of sadness. "We cannot all stop," she said softly. "The storm will take us." The Apache woman nodded. She understood. She did not argue or cry out. Begging would not change the snow or the cold. She watched as the group gathered what little they could spare. A thin blanket, a small pouch of dried roots. It was not much, but it was all they had. They left her near an old trading trail barely visible under the snow. Long ago, traders had passed through this area, leaving behind broken paths and half-forgotten shelters. It was the only place nearby that offered even a small chance. As the group moved away, their shapes slowly disappearing into the white distance, the woman sat alone. The silence after they left was heavy. Even the wind seemed to pause for a moment, as if the land itself was watching. She pulled the blanket tightly around her shoulders and tried to calm her breathing. panic would waste energy, and energy was life. She told herself she had survived worse. She told herself she would think clearly, move carefully, and not give in to fear. The sky darkened faster than she expected. Snow continued to fall, soft but endless. She stood and began walking along the old trail, hoping it would lead to something, anything. Each step was slow. Her feet dragged through the snow, leaving shallow marks that quickly disappeared behind her. As night came, the cold deepened. Her hands were stiff, her fingers barely moving. She tried to remember the warmth of summer, the sound of her children's voices, the feeling of sunlight on her skin. Those memories helped her keep going, even as her body grew weaker. She found the remains of a broken wooden post once used to mark the trail. Nearby, there was a low structure, almost hidden by snow. It looked like an old shelter, maybe used years ago by traders or travelers caught in bad weather. The roof had partially collapsed, but one corner still stood. She crawled inside, clearing snow with trembling hands. The shelter blocked some of the wind, but it offered little warmth. She tried to start a fire using the small tools she carried, but the wood was damp and her fingers were too cold. After several failed attempts, she stopped. She knew when to save her strength. She sat against the wall, knees pulled close to her chest. The cold crept in slowly, dangerously. She could feel it numbing her thoughts, making everything feel distant and unreal. That frightened her more than the storm itself. She told herself she could not sleep. Sleeping meant giving up. She sang softly under her breath, an old song her mother had taught her, meant to keep the spirit strong. Her voice was weak, but the rhythm helped her stay awake. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning in the darkness. At some point, she heard something that did not belong to the storm, a sound beneath the wind, footsteps. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The mind played tricks when the body was close to breaking. But then she heard it again, slow, careful steps crunching through snow. She pushed herself to her feet and stepped out of the shelter. The wind burned her face, but she forced her eyes open. Through the falling snow, she saw a figure moving along the trail, a lone traveler wrapped in heavy clothing, head lowered against the storm. Her heart raced. This was her chance, maybe her only one. Fear and hope mixed together inside her, making her chest tight. She did not know who this person was or whether they would help her. But if she did nothing, the cold would decide her fate. She stepped forward, her legs shaking. Her voice caught in her throat at first, dry and weak from the cold. She swallowed and tried again, forcing the words out. "Please," she called, her voice barely louder than the wind. The figure stopped. She took another step, nearly falling as her foot slipped. She held herself upright and spoke again, this time with all the strength she had left. "Do not leave me here," she said. "The cold will take me before morning." The traveler turned slowly, their face hard to see beneath layers of cloth and shadow. They did not speak at first. They only watched her, measuring the moment, weighing risk against compassion. The Apache woman felt fear rise in her chest, but she did not look away. She had lost too much already to be silent now. "I will not be a burden," she said, her words uneven but honest. "I will share what I have. I will give warmth, care, and loyalty. Just do not leave me to freeze." The wind roared around them, carrying her words into the dark night. She stood there, exposed to the storm, waiting for an answer that would decide whether this night would be her last. And in that frozen silence, with snow falling endlessly from them, the traveler did not move at first. He stood in the snow, watching the woman, weighing what he had seen. The storm had carved a harsh world around them, one in which trust was rare, and every choice could mean life or death. His eyes, shadowed beneath his hood, flicked to her face. There was fear, yes, but also something else. Determination. She was not a helpless person begging for charity. She was someone who had survived loss, hunger, and the bitter cold, and she was still standing. That alone demanded attention. He tightened the straps of the bag he carried across his back. It held supplies, but not enough for two, especially in a storm like this. And yet, leaving her here would mean certain death. He knew it. The wind tore at his coat, and the snow stung his face. But it was the thought of her alone in that relentless cold that made him step closer. "Who are you?" he asked finally, his voice low, carrying over the wind in jagged bursts. The woman swallowed, her lips raw from the frost. "I am someone who will not survive the night without help," she said simply. She did not demand pity, only action. "I have no one. My family, they are gone. I was left behind because I could not keep up." The traveler looked at her then, really looked, and he saw the truth in her eyes. They were eyes that had seen much pain, yet they still sought life, still searched for hope. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "I will help you," he said, "but you must promise to follow my lead. The storm is strong, and it will not wait." Relief washed over the woman in a way she had not felt in months. Her knees trembled, but she managed a nod. "I promise." Together, they moved cautiously through the snow. The trail was barely visible, covered in fresh white, and every step was a struggle. The woman's feet were numb, and her hands burned from the cold, despite the blanket she had wrapped around her. The traveler noticed and offered her a spare pair of gloves he had tucked into his coat. She accepted silently, grateful but too tired to speak much. Words were a luxury neither of them could afford in that frozen world. As they walked, the traveler kept his eyes on the landscape, alert for dangers that the woman could not see. Snow-covered rocks could hide deep holes. Thin ice could crack underfoot. Predators were unlikely in this storm, but the human element was always a threat. Bandits, other desperate travelers, or patrolling soldiers who would not hesitate to harm anyone in this remote land. Every movement, every decision was careful, calculated. The woman followed him faithfully. She moved slowly but steadily, learning to match his pace as best she could. Along the way, she tried to keep her mind from wandering into memories she could not change. The laughter of her children, the warmth of the fire in her old home, the smiles of people long gone. Those thoughts were like sparks in the snow, brief flashes of warmth that quickly vanished into the cold reality surrounding her. She focused instead on the sound of the travelers' steps ahead, the rhythm of their breathing and the faint path through the snow. By evening, they found a small hollow where the wind was slightly less fierce. It was barely a shelter, a natural depression in the earth partially blocked by rocks and fallen branches, but it was enough. They dug away the snow and built a small wall to block the worst of the wind. The traveler gathered whatever dry sticks he could find and managed to start a small fire. The flame was weak at first, sputtering in the gusts, but it soon grew steady, sending thin waves of heat into the cold night. The woman knelt by the fire, letting the warmth seep into her fingers and feet. For the first time in many days, she felt something like comfort. She did not speak, only watched the fire flicker, her eyes reflecting the dancing light. The traveler sat across from her, eating a small piece of dried meat he had carried. He offered her some, and she took it, biting slowly, savoring the taste of something solid in her stomach after days of hunger. They did not speak much that night. Words seemed unnecessary. The storm was a language of its own, howling and whispering around them. The fire crackled and snow continued to fall, but in the hollow, they were alive. And for the first time, the woman felt that maybe she would survive. Over the next few days, they settled into a routine. The traveler shared what little food he had, careful to stretch it as far as possible. The woman helped gather firewood from the sparse trees and brush, learning where to find the driest sticks hidden beneath snow. She learned to observe the patterns of the storm, when it would pause, when the snow would drift into the fire, and when it was safest to move. In the quiet moments, the traveler began to ask questions about her past. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she could speak of what she had lost. But she saw no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. She spoke softly of her husband, of the children she had buried, of the long, hard winters that had tested her people. She spoke of survival, not in grand terms, but in small daily acts, finding roots, melting snow for water, keeping a fire alive even when her body begged her to sleep. The traveler listened, sometimes offering small pieces of advice or encouragement, sometimes simply sitting in silence. He shared bits of his own story, too, though more sparingly. He spoke of his journeys, of the lands he had crossed, and of the loneliness that came from moving alone through the wilderness. He did not dwell on pain, only on lessons learned. The days were long and grueling. Snow fell continuously, covering tracks and landmarks, making every journey feel like a first attempt. Yet the woman's spirit began to lift, not fully, but enough to keep her moving. She found comfort in the small routines they shared, tending the fire, cooking food together, watching the snow fall in the gray light of morning. She learned the traveler's habits, and he learned hers. A bond began to grow between them, quiet and steady. It was not friendship in the usual sense, nor was it anything romantic. It was the kind of bond forged in hardship, in the shared struggle to survive a world that was often cruel and indifferent. They depended on each other without fully saying so. One evening, as the storm howled louder than ever, the traveler caught the woman shivering even with the fire at her side. He pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders and covered her with an extra blanket he had saved. She looked up at him, eyes wide, and whispered a simple thank you. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured. The storm did not relent. It pressed against them relentlessly, testing their endurance and their resolve. There were moments when hope seemed thin, when the cold threatened to overwhelm them both. But each day they found a way forward. They found food, kept the fire alive, and stayed together through the long nights. At times, the woman reflected on her initial plea to the traveler, the desperate words she had spoken in the first moments of their meeting. "Do not leave me to freeze," she had begged. She realized that those words had been more than a request for warmth. They had been a request for life, for recognition, for someone to see her as more than a shadow in the snow. And now, as she sat by the fire, she understood that the traveler had given her exactly that: acknowledgement, companionship, and a chance to survive. The traveler, for his part, noticed changes in her too. She had been timid at first, cautious in every movement. But now she moved with more confidence, her steps steadier, her decisions more deliberate. He recognized a strength that had been hidden beneath grief and exhaustion, a strength that had carried her this far and would continue to do so. Night after night, they faced the cold together. Sometimes the wind was so strong it seemed to shake the very earth. Snow piled around their makeshift shelter, threatening to bury it completely. They cleared it together, working silently, hands stiff with cold but hearts determined to endure. It was during one of these nights, as the fire cast long shadows on the snow, that the traveler realized something important. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about trust. It was about understanding that even in the harshest conditions, human connection could provide warmth that no fire alone could offer. And in that realization, both of them found a small but powerful hope, a hope that they could survive not only the storm, but the loneliness and loss that had shaped them. The days passed, each one a challenge, each one a test of endurance and courage. But with every sunrise, the woman felt a little stronger, a little more certain that she could continue. And with every sunset, the traveler felt a little more assured that helping her had been the right choice. Together they learned that survival was not just about food and fire, but about the bonds formed in the face of hardship, the silent promises, the shared struggles, and the quiet moments of care that made life worth fighting for. The snowstorm continued for days, relentless and unforgiving. Each morning the woman and the traveler woke to a world that seemed unchanged, though hours of effort had been spent clearing paths, gathering firewood, and reinforcing their shelter. The wind blew harshly, rattling the walls of the hollow where they took refuge. Outside, the landscape was a blur of white, making even the familiar paths almost impossible to recognize. Every day was a test of patience, endurance, and careful planning. The woman had grown stronger since the first night she had met the traveler. Her hands were no longer numb from the cold, though they still carried the scars of frost and exposure. Her steps were steadier, and she had learned to read the snow in ways she had not known before. She could judge where it was safe to step, which patches might hide ice beneath, and how to conserve energy for the long treks they occasionally had to make. The traveler observed her quietly. At first he had seen only a desperate figure in the snow, someone in need of help. But now he saw resilience, intelligence, and adaptability. She did not complain. She did not demand more than they could provide. She survived with quiet determination, and in that, he recognized a strength he had rarely encountered in his journeys. One morning, as the snow fell in thick, slow flakes, the woman and the traveler ventured further along the trail in search of food. They moved carefully, their eyes scanning the landscape for signs of life, tracks in the snow, bushes that might conceal roots, or remnants of game left by other travelers. The woman carried a small bundle of supplies, while the traveler held a staff that doubled as support and a tool for probing the snow. As they walked, they shared stories. The woman spoke of her family, of her childhood among her people, and of the lessons her parents had taught her about survival, patience, and the importance of community. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, carrying a wisdom born of hardship. The traveler listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just nodding, absorbing her words, like a teacher studying a student. "You have survived much," he said one afternoon as they huddled under a small overhang for shelter from the snow. "Many would have given up long ago." The woman shrugged, a small smile breaking through the lines of fatigue on her face. "I do not know how to give up," she said. "Even when there is nothing left, even when the cold is sharp, I move forward. I have no choice but to keep going." Her words struck the traveler. He had faced many storms in his life, both literal and metaphorical, yet he realized that he had sometimes allowed fear or uncertainty to stop him. In her, he saw a courage that was quiet but unwavering, a courage that did not need praise or recognition. The days were long and the nights longer. In the evenings they would return to their shelter, often exhausted and chilled to the bone. The woman would help maintain the fire, stacking wood and fanning the flames to keep them burning steadily. She learned to adjust the fire so it would last through the night, providing warmth without consuming too much fuel. Sometimes, when the wind howled particularly fiercely, they would sit close together, sharing the limited heat of the fire. There was no conversation, only the shared understanding of survival. Their bond grew stronger in these moments, not a bond of friendship in the usual sense, nor of family, but a connection forged in necessity and mutual respect. They had come to rely on each other, not only for physical survival, but for the quiet comfort that comes from knowing someone is beside you, sharing the burden of hardship. One evening, as they prepared a meager meal of roots and dried meat, the woman spoke of her people's traditions. She described the songs sung during winter nights, the dances performed to celebrate survival and resilience, and the stories told around the fire to teach children about courage, wisdom, and respect for the land. The traveler listened intently, fascinated by her knowledge and the depth of her connection to her heritage. "You carry your people with you," he said softly. "Even now, in this storm, they are with you." The woman nodded. "They are part of me," she said. "Even those who are gone still guide me. They taught me to endure, to observe, to respect the land. I cannot forget them." As the storm persisted, the traveler began to recognize the subtle ways the woman's presence affected him. Her resilience inspired him to be more careful, more thoughtful, and more patient. Her courage reminded him that survival was not just about physical strength, but about mental and emotional endurance as well. He found himself watching her closely, noting the small gestures she made to conserve energy, to protect the fire, and to navigate the treacherous landscape. Despite the harsh conditions, the woman maintained a sense of hope. She never allowed herself to be consumed by fear, even when the cold was severe and their food supply dwindled. She reminded the traveler of the importance of planning, of staying vigilant, and of maintaining a clear mind in the face of adversity. Her practical wisdom, combined with her quiet courage, became a guide for both of them. One particularly harsh night, the wind was so strong it threatened to collapse the shelter. Snow piled high against the walls, and the fire flickered dangerously. The traveler and the woman worked together, reinforcing the structure with branches and debris, using every ounce of strength they had. They moved with urgency, but also with careful attention, knowing that a single mistake could have disastrous consequences. After hours of labor, the shelter held. They collapsed inside, panting and exhausted, but alive. For a moment, they allowed themselves to rest, letting the fire warm their frozen hands and faces. The woman looked at the traveler and smiled faintly. "We survived," she said. "Yes," he replied. "We survived." The repetition of the storm, the shared labor, and the constant vigilance had created a rhythm in their lives. They had become attuned to each other's needs, habits, and patterns. The traveler learned when the woman needed quiet, when she required encouragement, and when she needed to take the lead in navigating the terrain. She, in turn, learned his limits, his strengths, and the careful ways he balanced risk and caution. Over time, they began to share more than survival skills and stories. They began to share small comforts, simple gestures that eased the weight of the cold and fear. The traveler would adjust the fire for her, ensuring that the warmth reached her hands and feet. The woman would offer him the best portion of food or the driest stick for the fire. These acts were unspoken expressions of care, demonstrating trust and mutual respect in a world where trust was scarce. One day, as the storm seemed to lighten slightly, they ventured further than before, discovering a small grove of trees that had somehow resisted the snow's full weight. There, They found roots and dried berries, enough to supplement their dwindling food supply. The discovery was a small victory, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, resourcefulness and determination could yield results. The traveler smiled at the woman, a rare, genuine smile that carried warmth beyond the fire. "You see what your strength can do," he said. "Even in the snow, even in the cold, you find a way." The woman nodded, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire and the faint hope that had grown between them. "We find a way together," she said. "Not alone, not against each other, together." As the storm continued, their bond deepened further. There was no need for grand declarations or promises. The shared struggle, the quiet acts of care, and the mutual reliance created a connection that neither had expected, but both had come to depend on. They learned to move in harmony, to anticipate each other's needs, and to support each other in ways that words could not fully capture. The traveler realized that the woman's initial plea, spoken so desperately in the first moments of their meeting, had not been only a request for warmth or shelter. It had been a call for recognition, a declaration that she still had the will to survive and that her life had value. By answering that call, he had not only saved her life, but also formed a bond that neither could have predicted. And the woman, through her strength, patience, and quiet courage, had taught the traveler a lesson he would carry long after the snow had melted. That true resilience is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the ability to move forward in spite of it, and that even in the coldest, most unforgiving conditions, human connection can provide warmth beyond what fire alone can offer. Together, they faced each day, each night, and each challenge the storm presented. And though the world outside was harsh and unyielding, within the small shelter they had built, there was a sense of hope, endurance, and mutual respect that neither had known before. It was not a story of comfort or ease, but a story of survival, strength, and the quiet power of shared humanity. Days passed slowly as the snowstorm continued, though now it seemed less fierce than before. The wind still howled and the snow still fell, but there were small signs that the storm was beginning to loosen its grip on the land. The woman and the traveler had grown accustomed to each other's presence, moving together in careful coordination, sharing small comforts and cautious routines. Survival had become a rhythm, almost second nature, but with the storm's persistence came a deeper awareness. They were beginning to rely on each other not just for safety, but for hope. The woman noticed the traveler observing her more often than before. Sometimes it was subtle, the way his eyes would linger on her hands as she arranged firewood, or the way he seemed to measure her movements when she stepped out into the snow. At first, she thought he was judging her abilities, worried she might falter and endanger them both. But over time she realized it was something different. Care, a quiet attention, born not from fear or suspicion, but from respect and concern. One afternoon, as the gray light filtered through the storm clouds, the traveler spoke for the first time about leaving, not harshly, not angrily, but simply, plainly. "When the storm ends," he said, "I may have to continue my journey. I cannot stay here forever." The woman paused. She had thought of this moment herself. She knew the traveler had his own path, his own life beyond the snow-covered hills. But hearing it spoken aloud made her stomach tighten. She had come to rely on him, not only for warmth and safety, but for companionship. Without him, the cold would return in its full force, and survival would feel heavier, lonelier. "I understand," she said softly, looking at the ground. "I do not ask you to stay. I only hope you do not leave me here to face the storm alone." The travelers studied her, seeing the truth behind her words. She was not begging this time. She was not desperate, though her fear was clear. She was prepared to face the night alone if he left. There was no manipulation, no pleading, only acceptance. Her strength was evident even in that quiet moment of vulnerability, and it struck him deeply. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved closer and offered a hand, steadying her as she brushed snow from her cloak. Then, "We stay," he said finally, firm but gentle. "Together. Until the storm ends, we face it as one. After that, we will see." Relief washed over her like a sudden warmth in the cold. She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Together," she whispered. That night, as they huddled near the fire, the bond between them deepened further. Words were sparse, but small gestures spoke volumes. The traveler adjusted the fire so its heat reached her feet. The woman passed him the driest sticks for the flames, carefully chosen so that the fire would last through the long, freezing hours. They shared the meager food they had with quiet efficiency, each ensuring the other had enough to maintain strength. As the storm raged outside, the woman reflected on her own journey. She had survived so much already: loss, hunger, exile. But this companionship had brought something unexpected. In the harshest of conditions, where life was measured by endurance and caution, she had discovered the value of trust and shared strength. She realized that survival was not merely about facing the elements, but about connecting with someone who could stand beside her in the cold and share both the burden and the warmth. The traveler, for his part, noticed changes within himself as well. He had traveled alone for much of his life, learning to rely only on his own skills and judgment. But in the woman, he saw a partner in the truest sense, someone whose courage and resourcefulness complemented his own. Her presence reminded him that even in the harshest conditions, one could find trust, companionship, and a reason to endure beyond personal survival. Days turned into weeks, and the storm gradually began to show signs of weakening. Snow fell less frequently, and the wind no longer carried the same sharp edge. The world outside their small shelter began to reveal glimpses of what had been hidden: the outlines of hills, the tops of trees, and distant trails that had been buried for days. Yet even as the storm lessened, the challenges remained. The food was still scarce, and the ground was covered in deep snow, making travel slow and exhausting. The woman and the traveler adapted, working together to prepare for the eventual journey ahead. They mapped the terrain as best they could, noting landmarks beneath the snow. They collected firewood, conserving it carefully for the nights that would still be bitterly cold. They rations for both, stretching their supplies and making plans for how to forage or hunt when the land opened up again. During these days, their interactions grew more natural. They spoke of small things, memories of past winters, favorite foods, or the comfort of a fire. They laughed quietly at shared experiences, small moments of levity that cut through the long stretches of hardship. These conversations, though simple, were a vital part of their survival. They reminded them that even in the hardest conditions, life could still contain moments of warmth and joy. One evening, the traveler noticed the woman staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. He approached her quietly, careful not to startle her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at him and smiled faintly. "Of all that has been lost," she said, "of those who are gone, and of what may come after the storm. I wonder if we will both find our way, or if the world will pull us apart." He considered her words, seeing the truth in them. The storm had brought them together, but the world beyond would not wait. Yet in that moment, he realized that it did not matter what might happen afterward. What mattered was the present, the shared struggle, the mutual care, the quiet resilience that had carried them through countless nights. "We will face it," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever comes, we will face it together for now. The rest, we cannot know yet." The woman nodded, drawing comfort from his presence. For the first time in many days, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond survival, a future where hope could exist alongside the harsh realities of the world. The warmth between them was no longer only from the fire. It was in the shared understanding, the trust, and the unspoken promise that they would not face the cold alone. As the days continued, the storm finally began to relent entirely. The snow slowed, the wind softened, and the land beneath the white blanket slowly emerged. Streams that had been hidden by ice began to flow again, and the tips of trees became visible above the snow. It was a subtle change, but it carried a profound sense of relief. The storm had tested them, shaped them, and in many ways defined their bond. But now the world was opening up, and with it came new choices. The traveler and the woman prepared for what would come next. Supplies were gathered, the shelter reinforced for any lingering cold, and plans made for their first steps beyond the hollow. They knew the journey ahead would be difficult. The snow-covered land was still treacherous, and they had to remain vigilant. Yet there was a newfound confidence between them, a quiet strength that came from having endured the storm together. At night, by the fire, they reflected on what they had learned from each other. The traveler realized that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet endurance, the steady decision to keep moving forward when the world seemed against you. The woman recognized that even in solitude, connection could be found, and that trust could provide warmth that fire alone could never give. One evening, as the last shadows of the storm faded from the hills, the woman spoke softly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and hope. "I came to you in desperation," she said. "I asked for warmth and survival, but you gave me more than that. You gave me trust. You gave me companionship. You reminded me that even in the hardest times, life can be shared, and that sharing makes it worth living." The traveler nodded, understanding fully the depth of her words. "And you reminded me," he said, "that strength comes in many forms. That endurance is more than physical, and that hope can exist even when the world seems frozen and cruel." Together, they sat in silence, listening to the gentle whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of water flowing beneath the melting snow. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, unlike anything they had experienced during the storm. And in that stillness, they understood the true value of their bond, not just survival, but the quiet courage, mutual respect, and shared strength that had brought them to this point. Though the future remained uncertain, they were ready to face it. The storm had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and shown them the power of trust and human connection. And now, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared on the horizon, they knew that together they could endure whatever lay ahead. The woman's heart, once heavy with grief and fear, felt lighter than it had in months. The traveler, who had traveled alone for so long, felt a sense of purpose and partnership that he had rarely known. And though the road beyond the snow was still long and uncertain, they faced it with a courage strengthened by their shared trials and the quiet warmth of human connection. The storm had finally passed. The wind no longer cut through the air like sharp knives, and the relentless snow had softened into gentle drifts that reflected the pale light of early morning. The world around the woman and the traveler was still cold, still marked by the harshness of the winter, but there was a sense of calm, of relief, that neither had felt in weeks. The land, once a white blur, now revealed small signs of life. frozen streams beginning to trickle, the tips of branches peeking through the snow, and the faint tracks of animals cautiously returning. It was a quiet, tentative rebirth, and both of them felt its weight. They had survived the worst of the storm together. Nights of frost and hunger had tested every ounce of their strength, and days of travel through snowdrifts and icy terrain had pushed them to the limits of endurance. But through it all, they had learned to rely on one another, to share not just the physical burden of survival, but also the unspoken emotional weight that came with fear, loneliness, and loss. They were no longer just two strangers caught in a storm. They had become a team, connected by the trials they had faced and the quiet trust that had grown between them. On the morning that the snow finally eased, the woman looked at the landscape and realized how far they had come. They were still far from any settlement or familiar ground, but the paths they had cleared, the shelter they had reinforced, and the supplies they had gathered gave them a sense of security. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope, not just for survival, but for what might come after. The traveler noticed the shift in her demeanor. She moved with steadier steps, her hands no longer trembling from the cold, and her eyes shone with a quiet determination. He, too, felt a change within himself. The storm had tested him as much as it had tested her. He had learned patience, endurance, and the value of shared strength. He had seen courage in its quietest, most persistent form, and it had inspired him in ways he had not anticipated. They packed what supplies remained, careful to preserve their limited resources. They prepared the shelter for any lingering cold nights, reinforcing it with branches and rocks, making sure the fire could be rebuilt quickly if needed. They had become meticulous in their planning, every movement measured, every decision deliberate. The storm had taught them that survival depended not only on strength, but on foresight, adaptability, and careful observation. As they moved through the snow-covered land, the traveler led the way, with the woman following closely. Their footsteps left shallow impressions that would soon be covered by drifting snow. But they did not worry. They had learned that survival was not about permanence in the landscape, but about the choices they made moment by moment. Every step was deliberate, every pause calculated, and every shared glance a reminder that they were not alone. During one brief pause, the woman spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I wonder what lies beyond these hills," she said. "Will we find others? Will we return to our people? Or will the world be different from what we remember?" The traveler thought for a moment before answering. "I do not know," he said, "but I do know that we face it together for now. And that is enough. The rest we will see when it comes." Her eyes met his, and she nodded. The words carried weight, not as a promise, but as a recognition of the present. They could not control the future, nor could they undo the past. All they had was the journey before them, and they had chosen to face it side by side. As they continued, the snow gradually thinned, revealing patches of frozen earth and sparse vegetation. Small animals cautiously emerged, and the distant sound of flowing water suggested that spring was approaching. The traveler and the woman moved more freely, their steps no longer weighed down by the constant vigilance of the storm. The land, though still harsh, seemed to welcome them forward, offering glimpses of life and renewal. Along the way, the woman shared memories of her family, of the traditions and stories passed down through her people. She spoke of songs sung during winter nights, of lessons learned from her parents and elders, and of the quiet resilience that had been instilled in her from childhood. The traveler listened intently, absorbing the wisdom and strength in her words. He realized that her survival was not only a matter of physical endurance, but also a testament to the spirit she carried within her, a spirit shaped by generations and refined by hardship. In return, the traveler spoke of his own journeys, of distant lands he had crossed, and of the lessons he had learned from solitude and observation. He spoke sparingly, choosing words carefully, but the woman recognized in his stories a similar resilience. Though they came from different worlds, their experiences had shaped them in ways that allowed them to understand one another without the need for explanation. As the days passed, the traveler and the woman began to see signs of human life beyond the wilderness. Smoke rose in the distance, and the faint sound of voices reached them through the cold air. It was a reminder that the world outside their isolated struggles still existed, and that their survival had brought them closer to it. The thought of returning to communities, of sharing news and resources, brought a renewed sense of purpose. Yet, even as they approached signs of civilization, there was an understanding that their paths might soon diverge. The traveler had his journey, and the woman had her own. The bond they had formed was strong, but the world beyond the storm was unpredictable. They could not know what challenges awaited them, nor could they guarantee that their paths would remain aligned. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, the woman and the traveler sat by their fire. The warmth was comforting, but it was the shared silence that held the greatest meaning. They did not need words to express the depth of their connection. Every glance, every gesture, every small act of care spoke volumes about trust, endurance, and companionship. The woman turned to the traveler and spoke softly. "When this journey is over, I may continue alone. But I will always remember what you have done for me. You gave me more than warmth or protection. You gave me hope." The traveler nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "And you have given me something I did not expect," he replied. "You have reminded me of courage, patience, and the strength found in quiet endurance. I will carry it with me wherever I go." As the first hints of spring began to touch the land, the melting snow, the softening wind, the faint smell of earth, the traveler and the woman made their final preparations to leave their temporary shelter behind. They gathered their remaining supplies, reinforced the fire one last time, and stepped into the world beyond the hollow. The land was still challenging, but the experience of surviving the storm together had prepared them for what lay ahead. They walked side by side, their steps confident and deliberate. The snow that had once seemed endless was now a part of their story, a reminder of the trials they had faced and the bond they had forged. Each step forward was an act of endurance, a continuation of the quiet determination that had carried them through the harshest days and nights. Eventually, they reached the edge of a small settlement, where smoke rose from chimneys and the sound of life was clear and constant. People moved about their daily tasks, unaware of the struggle that had occurred in the wilderness beyond. The traveler and the woman paused, taking in the scene. It was a reminder that life continued, that survival was not only about enduring hardship, but also about returning to the world with renewed strength and purpose. The traveler turned to the woman. "This is where our paths may part," he said. "You have your journey ahead, and I have mine. But I hope you remember that you are stronger than you know, and that the bond we have formed will stay with you." The woman smiled, a mixture of gratitude and sadness in her expression. "And I will remember," she said. "I will carry what we have shared with me, and it will guide me in the days ahead." They embraced briefly, a gesture of shared experience and unspoken understanding. There was no need for promises or assurances. Their time together had been defined by endurance, trust, and mutual care. That was enough. As they parted ways, each continued into the world with renewed strength. The traveler resumed his journey, carrying with him the lessons learned from the woman's courage and resilience. The woman moved forward with confidence, knowing that she had survived the storm and that the trust she had placed in another human being had been honored. In the years that followed, the woman's story would be remembered among her people. She would continue to live with resilience and wisdom, becoming a guide and healer in her community.